As our listeners know, capitalism is dedicated to the discussion of what is working in capitalism and what isn't. But from the very first episode of the second season with Bethany, we decided to focus also on the interaction between capitalism and democracy. And one of the essential elements of a healthy democracy is the existence of a marketplace of ideas. And the possibility of a marketplace of ideas depends crucially on the role of media. These days, a big role in the media market is played by social media. In the last few months, the social media under most scrutiny has been Twitter, not only for the controversial takeover done by Musk, but also for the opening of the archives of Twitter's previous moderation decisions, a series of articles that goes under the name of Twitter Files. If you've never heard about them, you're not alone. A large part of traditional media have ignored the Twitter Files, labeling them nothing burger. Some non-traditional media have discussed them as the greatest revelation since the Pentagon Files. Bethany and I decided that we should discuss them. Are they important or not? What they reveal about the biases in the process of amplification in social media? And what do they suggest about how to regulate, if at all, social media? We thought hard about who to invite to discuss this topic with us. But we realized that it's basically impossible to find a neutral commentator. The world is so divided that we decided to do our own research. First of all, our valuable researcher, Utsav Gandhi, prepared a very interesting summary based on the various accounts that he could find on the Twitter Files. If you want to see the entire story, you can find this account under Nothing Burger in the promarket.org. What we're going to do in this episode, Bethany will present a short summary of this research, and then we're going to discuss the implication.
I'm Bethany McLean.
Did you ever have a moment of doubt about capitalism and whether greed's a good idea?
And I'm Luigi Zingales.
We have socialism for the very rich, rugged individualism for the poor.
And this is Capital Isn't, a podcast about what is working in capitalism.
First of all, tell me, is there some society you know that doesn't run on greed?
And most importantly, what isn't?
We ought to do better by the people that get left behind. I don't think we should kill the capital system in the process.
What was the most stunning thing to me about this research was the fact that it is so polarizing and that some people can dismiss it as nothing and others think it is this giant controversy. The reality is it shouldn't be polarizing. It shouldn't break down along the lines of left and right. It's just pretty shocking and scandalous, regardless of where you sit on the political spectrum. And what I mean by that is just the sheer number of times that people at Twitter have intervened to change the discussion, to block certain news, to make sure certain people aren't heard, to elevate some discussions so that they're louder than others. To me, the overall takeaway is that they do this in ways that are both explicit by banning people and not explicit by what they call visibility filtering, which they say is not the same thing as shadow banning, but I'm really struggling with how visibility filtering is not shadow banning. I mean, if you make somebody so dark that you can't hear them, then haven't you sort of shadow banned them? Anyway, we'll get into that. But again, I don't understand that we're not all discussing this, because to me, there are two big things that jump out that are different about this than they were with the traditional media. One, and perhaps I have some unwarranted nostalgia for old media, but old media had a real deep sense of responsibility about this. This was what editors did. I think another point of difference is that it was really clear when you read the New York Times, you're reading what the New York Times considers as the news that is fit to print. It wasn't a secret that it was being curated by the editors, whereas in the case of Twitter, I think it very much has been a secret. A third really important difference is that there's only one Twitter, whereas in the days of old media, sure, there was the New York Times, there was the Wall Street Journal, there was the LA Times. It didn't matter as much if some things were being suppressed because they were being heard elsewhere, whereas on Twitter, because of its monopoly-like status, if they're being suppressed, they're being suppressed. And I think all of this is incredibly important for people to understand and to discuss openly.
To be honest, I was quite shocked by the entire series of the Twitter Files. The thing that I found most interesting is the moderation of the COVID debate. Here I reveal my true nature because I'm an academic and I do think that there is such a thing called a real science where you can have an objective truth. Now, if you debate whether Bernie Sanders is a socialist or Trump is a fascist, we can disagree to the end. But if I say the vaccine is helpful or not helpful, or the vaccine fights this or doesn't fight that, these are propositions that can be tested, rejected, or confirmed. Now, my reading of the Twitter files is Twitter did a terrible job even on this front, where they not only block certifiable wrong information, which we can discuss whether it's right or wrong, but at least it's justifiable, but they even block objectively right information for the fear that can be misinterpreted by the public. This is, to me, is the ultimate patronizing thing in which you don't want to tell the truth because you are afraid that the truth can be misinterpreted. That's the ultimate big brother kind of approach. One of the Twitter files said there was a professor of virology at Harvard that said natural immunity is as good as a vaccine. First, they slapped the notice, this is not a correct statement, and then they made it difficult to amplify that message. The worst part of all is that part of this was done under pressure from Scott Gottlieb, that is the board member of Pfizer. So there's even a financial interest. I don't want people to even think about that there is a substitute to the vaccine. I want everybody to be vaccinated. And by the way, the guy who's pushing it makes a lot of money out of vaccine. Now, right. You can say that it was doing it because of some superior motive, but it's funny that there is also this conflict of interest.
Yeah, I think you might be mixing and matching two issues, and these were unearthed by a guy named Alex Berenson, who himself was banned from Twitter for spreading vaccine misinformation. But one part of this was a guy in the White House named Brett Giroir tweeting that natural immunity was superior to vaccination, and he went on in his tweet to say, by the way, if you haven't gotten COVID yet, please get vaccinated. And Scott Gottlieb went to Twitter and got that tweet marked misinformation, because he said it was wrong. And here we are a couple of years later, and it's still unclear whether natural immunity is better than vaccination or not. There's an ongoing debate about that. But what's for sure clear is that there is a debate. It's not natural immunity is actually worth a lot, and that should have been a debate back at the time. And instead it wasn't allowed. And I remember sitting at a dinner party in California with very politically correct people and having them all say, oh, those Trumpian idiots who believe natural immunity does anything. And I thought to myself, doesn't it? I think I better keep my mouth shut. I don't know. But it did. It became this thing that you weren't allowed to say. And that thing that you weren't allowed to say was reinforced by Twitter, and reinforced because Scott Gottlieb, a board member of Pfizer, was asking Twitter to do it. And there's just nothing about that is good. It turned out that was a valid source of debate. And then the other part of it was the virologist at Harvard pointing out that COVID was not that dangerous to healthy children. And again, Scott Gottlieb intervened. It was right before the vaccine got approved for under 5-year-olds, and Gottlieb got intervened to get that tweet either blocked or the guy banned for having tweeted it. And the fact is that's true. If you have a healthy child, if you're lucky enough to have a healthy child, COVID is not that dangerous to them. And again, it just I'm not sure what you decide to do with that, but for sure there has to be some disclosure that this is happening because a board member of Pfizer is asking for it to happen. I, in myself, find some of this very confusing terrain to navigate the rights and wrongs of it, but I do think, again, the disclosure is one of the key problems here. When I found out that happened because of Gottlieb's intervention, it's just deeply, deeply upsetting without disclosure.
What do you think we should do? Because you're not in favor that every opinion should be spread out. And it says we have right of free speech, but not right of free reach.
Right. Well, I think there are one of two ways to go, and I'm tossing this out there. I'm not sure this is right, so let me say it and let's debate it. I think the one of two ways to go are to say, all points of view are allowed. Hate speech aside, hate speech is something different. That is against the law. That's different than, say, vaccine misinformation, or what is labeled vaccine misinformation. But one way to do it is to say it's all allowed. We're not going to amplify some of this and ban some of this because somebody who's on the board of Pfizer intervenes to get this banned. We're just it's going to be a content platform, and we're going to put it out there. The other way is to have people at Twitter shaping it and shaping what's allowed and shaping what gets amplified, but then that has to be disclosed, and it has to be disclosed exactly what they're doing and why they're doing it, so that you users know and understand what's happening. And so I'm going to put that out there as a framework, either or, but not both, which is we pretend to be a content platform where all points of view are out there, but actually secretly we're anything but.
I think is a good idea, but one of the problem is some of this amplification is done algorithmically. And that's a little bit more difficult to be transparent. I think what we discover, and this is, by the way, one of the most important facts that emerges from the Twitter files that deserves a debate, is the fact that Twitter was not working only algorithmically. There was a lot of human intervention. So when you hear Facebook or Google say, oh, but everything is done algorithmically, now maybe they're better organized than Twitter. I would like to have sort of investigation on that. But I doubt that there is not some pressure in the same way in which there was a pressure at Twitter. And that becomes sort of a trading market for favors rather than a transparent system. If there is one thing you remember, one thing you want to discuss, I think this is it. I think that after the Twitter file, the FTC should go after Facebook and Google and say, we want to see your mechanism of amplifying, non-amplifying, selecting, to what extent is algorithmic, to what extent is there is human intervention, and under which pressure you exert human intervention. I think that we want transparency. We should have transparency of all the major sort of big tech media.
I did want to back up to this point because I think it's important. You may not agree with it, but one of the reasons that I don't think the Twitter files are a partisan scandal and why I'm so surprised that there's this partisan divide about them is we actually don't know. It's sort of the same problem that plagued our McKinsey episode in a way. There simply isn't the data to know how bad McKinsey is, both in the scope of its overall engagements and as ranked relative to other consulting firms. And there isn't the data in the Twitter files to understand whether Twitter was biased Democrat or biased Republican. We've got sort of selective disclosure. In some places, it looks like they were biased toward Democrats. In other places, it looks like they were biased toward Republicans. For sure, they were biased on COVID toward filtering speech that they viewed as misinformation. But to me, more broadly speaking, it's not really clear that this is that Twitter is a political scandal one way or the other. And even the episode that I thought going into this was the clearest evidence that it was a political scandal, which is the Hunter Biden episode, I came out thinking that it wasn't.
Honestly, the Hunter Biden episode for me is scary not so much for Twitter, but for the role that the FBI played.
Yeah.
So for those of you who have not heard about this episode, so Hunter Biden left a laptop at a repair shop and never returned to get it back. And so after a year or 2 years, the owner of the repair shop actually opened it up, saw there was something controversial, and called the FBI. And the FBI took a hold of the computer, and this was December 2019. Before giving that computer back to the FBI, the owner made a copy. And so when it came like July or August and the FBI was not doing anything, he decided to give that copy to Rudy Giuliani, that then gave it to the New York Post, and then the New York Post wrote an article. Now, what is interesting is the FBI had this piece of information in December 2019. When the news that this scandal was started to emerge, the FBI went out to Twitter, Facebook, and everybody saying that you have to be careful about Russian misinformation. We think this is a piece of Russian misinformation. So it was like preparing the various social media that if they were to repeat that, they would be part of a Russian misinformation campaign. When they knew perfectly well that this was authentic because they had the laptop 6 months before. Now, this is the FBI under Trump as president. So, first of all, even if Biden had to be president, this was a scary thing. The fact that this is the FBI under Trump as president suggests the FBI plays a political role that has nothing to do with who is the president. So it's its own political game. If you wanted the exhibit A of a deep state, this is like the biggest exhibit A.
So yes, that's the second aspect of that is why I was saying it isn't a political scandal at Twitter, because I think, at least based on what I read, nothing has emerged that suggests to me that Twitter didn't buy into this idea coming from the FBI that it might be part of a Russian disinformation campaign. And of course, based on what happened in the election, in the Trump versus Hillary Clinton election, where the FBI arguably did play a pivotal role by forcing the release of the Clinton investigation right before the election, you can see that everybody was on high alert about this. And that's why I originally thought, not knowing the whole story, I originally thought that this was a clear example that Twitter was biased in favor of Biden and that they were deliberately suppressing this story in order to help Biden win the election. And that's not what happened. That's very clearly not what happened. Unless there's other evidence that I haven't seen. I shouldn't say very clearly given the murkiness of all of this. But that it seems to me they were genuinely worried that it was Russian disinformation. But you're right. The role played by the FBI, that is supposedly this apolitical investigative entity and clearly has its own biases at work in all of this, is what should be investigated in the course of this. Again, another story that people aren't looking at because no one wants to look past the obvious headlines about Hunter Biden and whether this is a scandal reflecting on Twitter trying to get Biden elected as president, to look at what the real underlying issue is. And I agree with you, that's the real underlying issue.
I don't think that Twitter wanted to influence the election. I think that Twitter was, as you said, number one, scared by the possibility of having a role and a bad role in the election. But number two is influenced very much by the people at the top. They have a view of the world and they feel they have to play a role. I think there is no remedy. If you give too much power to a firm, somebody has to exercise this power, whether it's the owner, like Elon Musk, or where is like a small team of employees. If they have their own bias, their own views, and they are going to be very influential in how things unfold. So the bias against Trump was more shown in the banning after January 6th. That, to me, was inconsistent with the way Twitter behaved with other dictators or other with dictators around the world. Trump is not a dictator, but other sort of president or other sort of.
That was a nice Freudian slip, Luigi.
Yes, it was. But you see what I mean.
Yes, but let's come back to that. But I do think, again, I can't believe I'm somehow sort of playing the role, at least on this one narrow aspect of Twitter defender. But the traditional media did not cover itself in glory over the Hunter Biden episode either, because after the New York Post published that story, the rest of the media said, no, the horrible New York Post, and only belatedly, I think the Washington Post is the only one to really have done a mea culpa and say, no, this was real. So I think for all that I set up at the beginning of this discussion, a distinction between the traditional media and Twitter, the traditional media did not cover itself in glory on this either. And I do think, just one layer behind that before we move on to Trump, the ban against Trump, I do think that it is scary when the FBI comes knocking at your door. It just is. Whether you should be scared of the FBI or not, they do have this unique role in American life that when the FBI calls or you get an email from somebody at the FBI, you just have this. I actually think that is a whole separate subject of investigation. But anyway, back, what's your view of the ban against Trump, and how did what was unearthed in the Twitter files change your mind, if at all?
So I don't think I was shocked by what I learned in the Twitter file. If there was incitement to violence, like there were in, I think, in a couple of cases with Alex Jones or other people, then it's clear that you want to stop somebody. My understanding of the Twitter file is that it's not that Trump violated any particular policy, is that there was a huge pressure from the headquarters of Twitter to basically stop Trump. And, it was relatively easy because he has lost the election, so he wouldn't be president for long. And I think that it was something easy to do and very satisfying for the employees of Twitter, and that's what they did, but was inconsistent with what they'd done with other head of states in situations that in some cases were much, much worse. I think it's worrisome that a private entity, whether it's ruled by a billionaire or is ruled by a few millionaires, because it's not like employees of Twitter, especially the higher up, are men of the people. They are millionaires. So whether you have one billionaire or a few millionaires making the decision on whether the head of a state can diffuse his information, I think is a mistake, and particularly when this is done in coordination with the other sources. So it's basically a form of collusion to not let him talk.
Yeah, I think that I have such mixed emotions around Trump being banned from Twitter, but this did change my mind on it, because I don't think I had ever quite understood how hypocritical that was, which you alluded to. But Twitter announced Trump's permanent suspension in quote, due to the risk of further incitement of violence. And at the same time, as Barry Weiss pulled up and Youth's office highlighted for us, they have let tweets that are equally, perhaps worse, go unpunished. For example, in June 2018, Iran's Ayatollah Ali Khamenei retweeted, "Israel is a malignant cancerous tumor in the West Asian region that has to be removed and eradicated. It is possible and it will happen." Twitter neither deleted the tweet nor banned the Ayatollah. In October 2020, the former Malaysian prime minister said it was a right for Muslims to kill millions of French people. Twitter deleted his tweet for glorifying violence, but he remains on the platform. And so the hypocrisy around all of this is pretty astonishing to me. And again, it just shows the randomness of the decision making. That is disturbing. The thing that actually got to me the most, and I'd love to hear, Luigi, if you think I'm overreacting to this, but Hamilton 68, which was this digital dashboard that claimed to track Russian influence and was the source of hundreds, if not thousands, of mainstream print and TV news stories in the Trump years. And Hamilton 68's analytical method was nothing more than a list, sort of proprietary analysis linking Twitter accounts to Russian activities online. And Hamilton 68 became very credible in the press, and all these reporters and TV personalities who were making these claims about Russian bots never really knew what they were even describing, and that was all a scam, that Hamilton 68 wasn't actually tracking how Russia was influencing American attitudes. They were simply collecting a handful of mostly real, mostly American accounts and describing their conversations as Russian scheming. And Twitter recognized right away that this was a problem. Their head of security wrote, "Real people need to know they've been unilaterally labeled Russian stooges without evidence or recourse." And I mean, even Harvard and Princeton and NYU and other universities were promoting Hamilton 68 as a source. I mean, it sounds worse than McCarthyism, right? In the sense that you could get labeled a Russian bot or under the Russian influence by Hamilton 68. You'd never know. And you'd never have any recourse against this. And it was all sort of secretive and claiming, supposedly driven by science once again, and it was all just made up. I mean, I think it's insane. Do you not think it's insane?
It is insane. So do you know, Bethany, whether you were labeled as part of the Russian propaganda by Hamilton 68?
Oh my God, I wonder if I was. That's hilarious. Particularly early on in the pandemic when I was really, really outspoken about the need to get schools open. And then even my friends in the media said, "I didn't know you were a Trump voter." I was like, when did a position on children and education become aligned with one's status as a Trump voter? But anyway, maybe that did get me. Maybe I'm on the list of Hamilton 68 too. I think I might be giving myself too much credit. I doubt anybody cares about me that much, but
You'll be surprised. But I think that you are absolutely right. What is unbelievable is that in a period of science and technology where we could have some systematic way to select this information, and even if you wanted to make up, you could at least have some dignity and some filtering of this. No, we are back to, as you said, McCarthyism, in that, I heard that this guy is a friend of, boom, you are a communist, you are considered persona non grata that cannot participate in any activity. And we are back to that world amplified by the social media, because the power of blacklisting you on social media is enormous.
Have you ever wondered what goes on inside a black hole? or why time only moves in one direction, or what is really so weird about quantum mechanics, well, then you should listen to Why This Universe. On this podcast, you'll hear about the strangest and most interesting ideas in physics, broken down by physicists Dan Hooper and Shalma Wegsman. If you want to learn about our universe, from the quantum to the cosmic, you won't want to miss Why This Universe, part of the University of Chicago Podcast Network.
Bethany, you are an experienced journalist, so I want to ask you the question you open with, which I think is probably the most important one to understand where we are today, which is why nobody talks about this. Because what we described so far, it seems to me they're not particularly partisan issues, and they are issues that are at the core of the media world, at the core of our democracy, and nobody talks about it.
I know. I don't have an answer. I have a few theories, so I'm going to toss them out there and then we can see where we go. I think that it has become I think that as a society, people are increasingly unwilling to think for themselves. So just like wearing masks became a sign of your political status, your view on the Twitter files also became an immediate tell as to who you are as a person. And so in certain circles, if you give the Twitter files any credence, well, then you're obviously a bad human being who shouldn't be permitted to speak. I think it doesn't help that it was released under Elon Musk, and Musk himself has been a complete hypocrite about this, because while ostensibly pushing for the right to free speech, he himself banned a journalist he didn't like for disclosing, by the way, completely public records about where Musk's private plane has been. So I think that adds an element of just sleaziness and lack of trustworthiness to the whole thing. I think Musk's choice of where the Twitter files went was also, at least initially, was also shaped the debate in a way that perhaps wasn't helpful, but he gave them to journalists he thought would be friendly to various causes. That's not really fair. I have a lot of respect for Matt Taibbi, for Bari Weiss. He didn't give them then to the New York Times as well. And so he created, by the way in which the information was originally doled out, it created this idea that you were taking sides to write about it. Whereas if he had just tweeted, here, I'm putting all this stuff online, find in it exactly what you want, nobody's getting anything, maybe that would have opened the door to a more even-keeled conversation.
I think they're all probably right. I like the first one, and as you were talking, it occurred to me that this issue that we decide on what side of the fence you are based on your opinion, it always existed, but now it has exploded, and I think it's the result of information overload. So in the old days, we got a lot of filter news. We could have our own opinion because we already had limited amount of information. Today, you basically drink from the hose. Every topic you go on the internet, you have millions of stuff. And so it's very hard to filter. I've seen myself at the beginning of COVID, as probably most people, I was obsessed with news and trying to figure out what was the truth. You can spend day and night trying to make up your mind and still not know what the truth was. And I think that in this world where information is plenty, in the past was scarce, but now information is plenty, you need a way to filter information. And then you resort to the most partisan thing. Are you a friend of a foe or a foe? And so if you are a friend, I accept your information. If you are a foe, I don't want to waste my time listening to your information because I have too much information. But that leads to the paradox that in a world where information is abundant, we are all very ignorant.
Yes. And I think that's exactly right. I think that is most of the explanation. It's complexity and overload. And so it is far easier to just accept the opinions that belong to what you think is your tribe. And I remember when I first learned the term virtue signaling, I thought it was just so amazing. And I think that all of this is also a form of virtue signaling. It's also a way of conveying to others in a room who you are and where you stand. So by refusing to acknowledge the Twitter files, you stand in a certain place. You've labeled yourself a certain kind of virtuous.
I think the virtue signaling is correct, but the question is, why do we need virtue signaling more today than in the past? And again, I think it's part of the fact that we need to process so much information, or we need to know about so many people. In a group that where you are a repeated player and you know each other well, you don't need to virtual signal. But on the internet, where you have millions of people you don't know, you have a desperate need to virtual signal. In the old days, we actually looked for provocative news because all the news was like the same. So you like somebody that say the alternative. Now you're bombarded with all the crazy theories on the face of Earth. And so you switch off. You don't even pay attention. If something starts to say, oh, I actually have doubt on the origin of the COVID virus, boom, you're immediately kind of conspiracy theorist, and I don't listen to what you say in the minute after that. I wanted to discuss, did you see that the chairwoman of the FTC basically asked Twitter to share the information that they share with the various journalists of Twitter File with the FTC? As a response, the Republican-dominated Congress said that this was a weaponization of the FTC. My understanding, I'm not a lawyer, but my understanding is the reason why the FTC or the chairwoman, Lina Khan, claimed that she has the authority to do that is because there was a consent decree done in 2011, and then I think we knew in 2019, between Twitter and the FTC about how Twitter was handling the privacy of its customers. So the argument is by sharing some of this information with the journalist, Twitter somehow violated the privacy of its customers, and that's the reason why the FTC can intervene. I think that there is an issue I'm not privy of, is what is the status of the ownership of the information on Slack, because the real revelation was what was written on Slack between or among the employees of Twitter. Okay, I'm torn here because my understanding is the legal authority is pretty shaky. However, from a public policy point of view, I think that she's doing a service, and paradoxically even a service to Twitter, because I think that by forcing to share that information with everybody will make the Twitter files more relevant, and as you said, will bring more transparency that is badly needed in this case. Elon Musk has sort of started the Twitter files in name of transparency, and he should live by that name and not just, as you said, being hypercritical. So I think that Lina Khan forcing him to live up to his principles will be a good thing for him. And if I were Lina Khan, I will do the same with Facebook and Google. In this way, that would be completely sort of remove any fear of partisan element, and will do a service for all Americans.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. And I think some really systematic look at this would be incredibly helpful. Total transparency and a really systematic look, because I suspect that that's going to abolish the idea that this is partisan somehow. I think Twitter staff clearly were left-leaning on all sorts of issues, but I think they faced a lot of pressure from Republicans to edit, to amplify, to do the same things that we are now aware that they face pressure from Democrats to do. And I think a really thorough look at this would lay to rest the question, who's been more aggressive about this, Republicans or Democrats? Is this a partisan scandal? Is it not? And I think clarity is really important on this issue, particularly because we are living in a monopoly world in terms of information. So Luigi, if you were Elon Musk, no, maybe that's not right. If you were the supreme ruler of the world, how would you reshape Twitter? What would you do from this point forward?
So I've been thinking about Twitter and Facebook, etc. for a while, and I think, to me, the only solution is to separate the posting side from the editing side. Think about Twitter. There are two functions. One is that I post on there, and the other is that my post is suggested to you, or amplify, or shadow ban, or whatever. From an economic point of view, the posting has a huge network externality. So I want to post where you are and vice versa. The editing has no network externality. So the editing can support a competitive market in the same way as newspapers were roughly competitive. The only reason why we don't have competitive market there is because the posting and the editing is integrated. And so you make all the money through the integration, so you subsidize the editing through what you get in the posting, and as a result, we end up with a monopoly or an oligopoly. So imagine that you had a public platform where you do the posting, and then everybody can choose their own editor. So I buy the Wall Street Journal editor, and I receive edited set of news. I'm not going to receive any news about sports because I don't care. I'm not going to receive any news of pornographic material. I'm not going to receive any news of super crazy material because the Wall Street Journal does the editing for me. And if I don't like the Wall Street Journal editing, I subscribe to the New York Times or to the Fox News editing. Now, this can only take place if the government intervene, force the separation, and then regulate the payment, because in my view, the question is who appropriates all the information and how do you support the business model of the editors. I think a subscription model probably is not going to get a lot of money out of it, but remains to be seen.
I think it's a lovely idea theoretically. I think it would not work in practice, and I'll tell you why. I think that if you knew, as somebody who was posting on Twitter, that your tweet was likely to be chosen by either a left-leaning publication or a right-leaning publication, you might be far less likely to tweet in the first place because of the chance of being misinterpreted and the horror of finding yourself on a platform that is not in accordance with your beliefs because the editor of that platform decided that your tweet was in accordance with their beliefs. I think it might shut down the whole thing.
Wait. Let me understand, because I don't understand. First of all, if you follow me, you're going to get my tweet, no matter what. So the only issue is if all of a sudden a right wing or a left wing decides to reproduce and amplify. Let's take the worst that can happen to you. A neo-Nazi editorial site decides to take your tweet and spread it. Again, if people understand that you have nothing to do with it and we're not engaged in extreme virtual signaling, I don't think that's a problem, because the next time around, people will not follow you because they read what you do, and it's not neo-Nazi material, they don't take you.
I think you're thinking like an economist and not, I think you're giving the world credit for being entirely too rational. I don't think I would give people credit for that rationality, and I don't even know that I would give myself credit for it. In other words, I know that if my tweet were chosen to be amplified by a neo-Nazi site, it would cause all sorts of issues for me, and I might even get kicked off. I might even get disinvited from some of the speeches I've been invited to give, even though that was absolutely not my fault that my tweet was chosen by that site. It still would have an enormous number of real world repercussions.
Wait, but this is the same thing as saying that if you get liked by a neo-Nazi, that's a problem.
It's different, because if you get liked by a neo-Nazi, not everybody knows. You'd have to go through and actually check every tweet to see if it's liked by a neo-Nazi. This is extraordinarily public. I'm speaking for myself. Perhaps I'm wrong. Perhaps most people would think like you, and they would be totally willing to take that chance and totally okay if that happened. I don't know that I would be. I have a little squeamishness around that. But I don't know. I could be the only one who feels this way. I personally really like the idea of just a really deep dive into Twitter, Facebook, and Google, where they have to reveal everything, and not just the possibly selective Twitter files, but everything, all the requests from the government, all the requests from lobbyists that have been made to amplify this or shadow ban this or do this, and have just complete and total transparency about the whole thing, even if it's just a massive data dump, so that there is a way to answer these questions. Is it ideological? Is it political? How are decisions being made? Who's making them? Who's been most hurt by this? Who's been helped by this? But so there really is a systematic big data way to look at this and answer the question for once and for all.
I think you're right. And, credit rating agencies, of course, they're very arbitrary in in the way they rate. However, they have a very clear procedure, and I testify in a case where a credit rating agency was involved. And so I went through the excruciating steps that they follow and how traceable they are, because if there is a legal case, they can document who made that decision, why, and what authority, and for what basis, and so on and so forth. And why is because their opinion is very important. If I downgrade the US government, this has dramatic consequences. And they even have independence of the analysts from the commercial people. So the commercial people cannot talk to the analysts in order not to influence that decision. So if we don't go to my solution, that I think is the first best, we need to, at the very minimum, go to your solution, which is a very reasonable second best, to have a very strong procedure and transparency of the procedure in the way you filter material. And then people might decide to opt in or out of the platform based on how sort of legitimate that procedure is. But certainly we cannot give that discretionary power either to one billionaire or to a few millionaires.
Yep, I completely agree with that. I think that's 100% right. And by the way, I really do. Of course, I like your solution, Luigi. I think it's absolutely perfect. I'm just not sure it's practically doable.
Capital Isn't is a podcast from the University of Chicago Podcast Network and the Stiegler Center in collaboration with the Chicago Booth Review. Also check out promarket.org, a publication of the Stiegler Center. The show is produced by me, Matt Hodap, and Leah Caesarine, with production assistance from Utsof Gandhi, Sebastian Burka, Chris Wheat, and Brooke Fox. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review for Capital Isn't wherever you get your podcasts.